everyone. Welcome to the Like the World podcast, and I'm your host, LT World. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author and a writer who is deeply interested in controversial issues and in philosophy and politics and things of those sorts. And on this podcast, I'll be striving to help us better understand what's going on in the public sphere, what's going on in society, and what a lot of different cultures and beliefs believe. And we're just going to be delving into a lot of different topics. And today, I'm continuing a series on postmodernism. So please continue to listen and enjoy. And if you like what you hear, subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're listening to. And before we jump into our topic of the day, I just want you guys to know that if you would like to know more about me or like to check out my writing, because I am a writer, I did write a couple books and stuff, and I will continue to be writing. You can check out ltworld.info, and it'll give you more information about me and my writing and stuff like that. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So last episode, to recap, we talked about the history and the background of postmodernism. We talked about what it was. We talked about its origins and its roots. And we talked about modernism and where modernism came from. And we kind of went from basically the Enlightenment period in Europe all the way to present day in America specifically, and also the West as a whole. So we kind of went through all postmodernism and history of it and what it is. And so today, what we're going to do is we talk about some common arguments in defense and against postmodernism. We're going to be talking about those common arguments today. So just to recap, the definition of postmodernism is that, well, at least the definition we're running with, we're not talking about art, we're not talking about we're not talking about like history, or we're not talking about certain other areas. We're talking about the philosophy of postmodernism. By and large and in general, postmodernists are skeptical of truth, or they're skeptical of ideologies and meta-narratives and overarching belief systems. They tend to also be skeptical of religions and things like that. And some, to the extreme extent, are complete relativists. They don't believe anyone can know truth. They believe all truth is relative, and therefore no one can really assert truth. And they don't believe in universal values. They don't believe in universal morals. They typically don't like tradition, and they don't like meta-narratives. And they tend to be more deconstructionists. And we'll be jumping kind of in that further episodes down the road about deconstructionists and stuff. We'll be talking more about that. But for now, that's just kind of a recap of what postmodernists believe and what they tend to support. And if you would like the further explanation or further history and background of what postmodernism is and how it got started and stuff, check out the last episode. We cover that. So today, we're going to be talking about three main arguments that postmodernists tend to assert. And we're going to be talking about these claims and these arguments from both sides, and trying to pull in some experts here and there, pull in just some general research I did, and give you both sides of an issue here. So the three arguments we're going to be talking about today is all truth is relative, moral values or judgments are subjective, and we ought to pursue social wellness rather than truth. So these are three very common arguments, very common assertions that are made by postmodernists. And they tend to be some of their core beliefs and core things that they pursue. There's a couple others that postmodernists tend to assert as well, but I'll be talking more about those actually in further episodes regarding different topics that are a little bit more nuanced and incorporate these similar things. Like we'll be talking about structure systems and systematic oppression, stuff like that, and critical theory, which incorporate a lot of postmodernist beliefs and postmodernist claims. So we're not covering all postmodernist claims, but we're just going to cover these three main ones today. All truths are relative, moral values and judgments are subjective, and we ought to pursue social wellness rather than truth. So let's just jump right into this. So, the first one, all truth is relative, or at the very least, the less extreme version of that is no one can know what truth is, or truth is elusive. And we're going to start with the pro side. We're going to start with the side that that supports this claim and what they say. And normally it starts off with the mind. It starts off with the idea that everything we interpret comes from our own mind. And actually, first of all, no one can really know if what we observe and what we think is really true. And it goes like this, kind of. There's a circular reasoning to proving that you exist, or proving that you know the truth. And the circular reasoning goes kind of like this, where, all right, to prove that right now I'm sitting in a chair, I would have to use my physical surroundings to prove I'm sitting in a chair. I would have to be like, well, I'm sitting in a chair because I can feel it. Well, how can I trust that I'm not just feeling a hallucination or some sort of dream or some sort of fantasy. Why couldn't it be possible? Well, theoretically, it's possible. So to actually support the fact that I am sitting in this chair, to support the fact that I am permanently present inside this room of mine, I would have to use the room itself. It would be circular. I have to use the conclusion to support. I would have to use the conclusion as my argument to support that the conclusion exists. Therefore, there's not really an argument taking place. It's just more of an assertion. So that's kind of the first thing they really rely heavily on is there's this idea that since you can't really prove reasoning and to prove truth most of the times and within the physical realm, it requires a lot of circular reasoning or a lot of faith or assumptions. So there's this idea that Nietzsche talks about kind of these different topics in his book Beyond Good and Evil. And Nietzsche made different claims and throughout his other books as well. That instincts, for instance, inform beliefs. That's another argument that takes place here. So not only is it a fact that you have to use the physical realm to support the physical realm existence, you have to use your mind and reason to defend a reason in your mind, which are all circular. There's also this idea that the subconscious and our instincts actually inform our beliefs and truths. Therefore, our pursuit of truth may be simply just being hardwired or socially molded. So, for instance, let's just talk about kind of morals, for instance. A lot of morals, they would say, is socially developed. The reason why in the West we support freedom or individual liberty is because of a social construct rather than an actual mandate from like a god or something. It's just socially developed because if you lived in Africa, you would have African beliefs. If you lived in Australia, you would have Australian beliefs. If you lived in Europe, you would have European beliefs. There's a social development to your understanding of truth and to your perception of the world. And you'll make arguments to defend your perception, not really defending truth. So since you have a perception on the world, that actually is what informs and gives you your insight into the world. You can't really know what truth is because your truth is already tainted by perception. Your truth is already tainted by instincts and society. And therefore, you can't really know what truth is. So, first of all, there's a circular process to defending reason, defending your existence. Then there's also the idea that there's a lot of perception going on here. You're given a lot of constraints and perception on your worldview that you're not even aware of most of the time. A lot of times it's just subconscious. And Nietzsche talks about this idea of your instincts informing beliefs and that philosophers are just spending their time defending their instincts. And there's also, now here's where the argument I think gets a little bit more complex, and I think this is where the argument actually has some of its stronger grounds, as far as its maybe ability to convince the idea that truth is relative, or at the very least, no one can know what truth is this idea that everything is language. Now, that might sound kind of weird. So, it might sound kind of weird to say that everything is language. Let's back up a little bit here. The idea that this chair is language, or this idea that I am language, doesn't really make any sense. But we use language and perception to distinguish differences. So the only way I can tell you what a chair is by being able to tell you what a chair isn't. And then I use those differences to explain to you what a chair is by not actually telling you what it is in of its own essence, but what it is compared to other things. And I can only do that by picking apart structures and using my observations, which again, we already talked about, can be circular. So you actually don't really know what anything is. All you know is what it is not and what it is compared to other things. But you actually don't really know in essence what it is. Therefore, we don't actually know anything. All we know is differences, and everything, therefore, is just language, because language helps us to understand those differences, but they don't help us understand what things are. It's kind of weird. That might take a little bit of time for us to muse over, but that kind of goes back to the idea of perception. So let's kind of go through this right a little bit now. Let's go through these three things real quick. So everything is of the mind. So we don't know for sure if anything outside of our mind is in existence. 1, 2. We don't even know if our mind belongs to us. We could be being manipulated by another being or God, and this idea of self could just be a figment of our imagination, and you can't prove anything otherwise. So we have everything's the mind, We don't even know if the mind is really ours or not, but we have this perception that it is. And therefore, every truth that we observe and everything we observe is just a perception. And therefore, we can't know what truth is because truth is being formed for us by other people and by our societies and our instincts and our mind, which we don't even know if it's ours. And then, further down, we actually don't know what anything actually is because, in essence, we can't explain anything only by its differences to other things comparatively. That is why Postmodernism 1 is hard to explain, because it's not really an ideology as much as it is a skepticism of all ideologies. That's kind of its goal. The goal of postmodernism is to question everything. And the goal of postmodernism is to say everything is relative, everything is socially constructed, basically. Everything is just a perception game, and therefore you better not be too dogmatic because you don't know what anything is. And that is, truth is relative. You can't know what truth is. And a lot of these postmodernists that you will read and stuff, we'll kind of talk about, like, they'll be kind of this mad genius to it. Kind of like Nietzsche had this mad genius to him, and he actually did go mad later in his life, but that's a whole nother story. But there's this mad genius to it, like, oh, we can't know anything. There's kind of like this nihilism or fatalism to it. So it's just a questioning of truth altogether. And it actually sounds rather convincing, I'm not going to lie, because there's a lot of it that logically makes sense. Well, yeah, we can't really prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, per se, that we are ourselves, or we can't escape circular reasoning when it comes to these things. So there's an air of skepticism that seems justified at the very least, if not correct in of itself. Now, of course, there's a flip side to this. There is the highly skeptical postmodernist saying you can't know what truth is, and at best you can't know what truth is, and ultimately truth is relative. That is the pro side. And it can kind of be like meshing of the brain and mushing it all up and tossing it all together, and it can seem a little bit weird. But there's a flip side to this. And the flip side is, no, you're wrong. And so the argument kind of goes like this. First of all, the people who say truth isn't relative, or that there is objective truth, will first point out the fact, by you saying there is no objective truth, or that all truth is relative, you're making a contradictory statement. You're claiming that that is true. And you're claiming, for the less severe side, that, well, no one can know what truth is, or we can't know what truth is because of what I just explained, they will say, well, you're saying you can know what that truth is. So if you can't know what truth is, you couldn't know that that is true. But yet you are claiming to know that is true. And therefore you're asserting it as truth. So it's a contradictory argument. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. And Norman Geisler kind of put it in a little bit more of a humorous way. In his one book, he said, in his one book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, he puts it like this. What amazes us is that parents all over the world are literally paying thousands of dollars in college tuition so that their sons and daughters can be taught the truth, that there is no truth. And that's basically how it is. You're asserting a truth that says there is no truth. It's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. And the other side, the other issue going on here is that it questions and it completely tries to annihilate the fact that you can trust your reasoning. It says you can't trust your reasoning. Everything's perception. You can't trust logic. You can't trust truth. But it constantly uses its senses. Postmodernists constantly use their senses, constantly use their reasoning, constantly use their logic, and constantly use their brains and minds to refute, question, and form their beliefs that they said you can't trust in the first place. So, at best, it's hypocritical. At worst, it's contradictory again. It doesn't really make sense. If you're using reasoning in your mind and you're using all these things that you said you can't trust, well, then why should I trust you? Why should I care about what you say? It's just as valuable as what I say. So at best, it becomes obsolete. At worst, it's utterly contradictory, which it is. It doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It kind of runs into a wall. It kind of runs itself into a wall. And now, to even expand more upon this, even if we would grant the fact that everything is concepts or instincts, or that you can only tell things by distinction, it doesn't necessarily take away the fact that there may be truth. Those distinctions in and of themselves may be true and objective. We can know the distinctions actually between a chair and not a chair. We can know the distinctions of right and wrong, those distinctions in of themselves are actually objectively observable and objectively true. That doesn't get rid of all truth. That just means that we may not be able to know within essence, without distinction, what things are. I don't know. Hopefully no one lost me there, but I hope you follow my train of thought. Just because something may not be understood in of itself without comparison to other things does not make the comparisons to those other things or the distinctions untrue. Those distinctions and observations stand to be true and objective. So there's another point out there about the whole everything's a structure, everything's a concept. No one can know what anything is. The other side of the postmodernist argument that there is no truth or that you can't know what truth is, it basically just puts up a mirror and says, look at yourself. You're being ridiculous right now. Yeah, it sounds like it makes sense, kind of. It sounds like a mad genius pulling up some sort of new insight to the world, but it's really not. It's just kind of a jumbled mess of contradictory thoughts. And that's sort of that's kind of the other side of the argument. And as you probably can tell already, I agree more with the side of the argument that says that there is objective truth. I wouldn't make this podcast if I didn't believe if I believed that no truth is objective, there would be, in my opinion, no point of this podcast because, well, believe whatever you want to believe. I believe there is objective truth. I believe that there are lies and things that are wrong. I don't believe that everything is just a structure or just a concept. And I think the very fact that the postmodernism, when it comes to the fact that all truth is relative or you can't know what truth is, can't stand on its own 2 feet, doesn't make any sense by itself, I think really puts into question that argument. And therefore, I agree with the side that says there is objective truth. You can know what truth is, at least to a certain extent. So, argument 1, taken care of. Let's move on to the next issue. Are moral values or judgments subjective? Now, that's the other assertion that postmodernists make, and we're going to start again with the pro side. People saying, yes, moral values and judgments are subjective. There is no such thing as universal morals, no such thing as universal values, no such thing as universal right or wrong. That right or wrong is just social constructs, or right or wrong is just my own personal opinion, but there is no objective right and wrong. And the first thing is an observation. Most cultures have different practices, different morals, different this and that. And so therefore, just by simple observation, we can tell that morality isn't purely universal or objective. And that actually doesn't make a lot of sense because, like, for instance, if I would go to, let's just say, China, their morals as far as sexuality goes is a lot different than the morals that are in America go when regarding sexuality. Let's just take, for instance, even the LGBT community within the West. Highly promoted, highly cared for, I would say. Some people may disagree with that, but a lot more than, let's just say, the Middle East or China. Definitely by leaps and bounds, a lot more safe and a lot more supported and protected than they are over there. Because the moral values are different. The things that they believe are different. So therefore, just observing culture, we can see that moral values aren't universal. They aren't objective. And taking it one step farther, now, a lot of postmodernists are atheists, agnostics, or they don't really believe in a god, or if they do, it's kind of a mystic god, I don't know. But a lot of times they're more secular. I'll just put it that way. So a lot of times they'll also assert that moral values that we have it's not even the fact that they're just social constructs or that they're culturally driven. They would even go as far as saying they're evolutionally driven. So, as I talked about, Charles Darwin really shook up a lot of theistic belief in the West. Well, that concept of evolution now, they apply it to, a lot of times postmodernists will apply it also to morality. The reason why you believe what you believe is right and wrong is because you evolved that way. Through evolution, through a process of millions of years, that's how we got our moral values. And therefore, that doesn't mean make anything right and wrong. It's just what you do, because it's ingrained in your nature to do so. It's not right and wrong. There's no God telling you what to do. There's no God telling you what is right and what is wrong. There's just nature. You're just acting out as, I think it was Richard Dawkins who said, dancing to the sound of your DNA, dancing to the music of your DNA. There is no right and wrong. There's just nature, and that's all there is. Now, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole of does God exist? That I would love to cover that in another episode, but not today. That's a whole other issue to tackle. But there's another argument. nature. Moral values aren't just, they're subjective because we can observe that cultures have different values. That moral values are just coming from nature, that there is no grounding outside of nature for moral values. And going even a little bit step farther with the cultural idea, even individuals within cultures disagree on morals. If there was universal morals, there should be a lot more agreement on the issue, at the very least. And there's not. And not everyone is convicted, and not everyone has the same conscience as everyone else. So, universal morals observably doesn't seem to be existing, and if there is no God, especially, there is no universal moral values. You can't really prove that there are universal moral values, and you can't really observe it. Now, on the flip side, obviously, that idea that moral values are subjective also is rooted more times than not in the idea that truth is relative in and of itself. So it's just kind of an extension to that. But then the flip side, people who say, no, there are objective moral values, there is universal moral values, will first point out the fact that, hey, actually, you can't think of a completely immoral society, a human society. Actually, a lot of societies are very similar. Now, C.S. Lewis kind of put it like this way: if anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, let's say, ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, Romans, what will really strike him will be how very like they are to each other. And he goes on to talk about more about other societies and how they had similar morals, and they just had different parameters. Now, so for instance, there's no country in the world, by what I've studied, by what I observed, and by what I know, that doesn't believe murder is wrong. Now, I will consent to the fact that they may disagree on the definition of murder to a certain extent. But the idea that an innocent man ought not to be killed stands the ground across the whole world. They may say, for instance, let's just go back to America's sad, tragic past with slavery. A lot of people have said black people weren't people. Therefore, it wouldn't be murder to kill them. Or so it would go. I disagree with that. I think that's horrible and horrendous. But that would have been an argument they would have made. But they would have disagreed. They would have said that a white person is a person, therefore you shouldn't kill them, because that would be murder, because murder is wrong. And every country operates like that. Every country believes that murder is wrong, that you ought not to murder someone. They may disagree on what counts as a person. They may disagree on what type of people you ought not to kill. But they would agree that murder is wrong. That's a universal value. And you can go down the list. Normally with rape or incest or these different universal values, they actually do stand across all cultures and society. So it's the same sweeping statement that all cultures have different moral values completely is sort of ridiculous on its face. There might be different parameters, but not as much different morals, per se. And most people who make this statement also, I just want to point out, don't really practice it. A lot of humanists, secular humanists in the West, tend to fight for causes like, let's just say, the pollution, getting rid of pollution, or fighting for LGBT rights, or fighting for different moral values that they want. And they'll go across the world and promote them. They'll go across the world to fight for them. Let's just say like Greta Thunberg for nature, and I don't really know anyone in the LGBT community who travels across the world defending it, but let's just say stuff like that. They'll travel across the world defending these causes, but if they actually believe that there are no universal moral values, then why are they promoting theirs so much? Why do they think theirs is so much better than everyone else's? There's really no distinction between the two. So most people don't actually put into practice what they believe when it comes to everyone has their own moral values, or no, there's no right and wrong, but yet they act like there is. There's kind of a hypocrisy to it. And one of the final things I would like to tack on there is just because people disagree on something, so for instance, a lot of cultures disagree on moral values and what they ought to be and what they ought not to be, doesn't mean there's not a right answer. The observation of differences and disagreement doesn't mean that there is no right and wrong. So, for instance, as a whole culture and society may believe that 4 plus 4 equals 9. They may believe adamantly that 4 plus 4 equals 9. Does not mean 4 plus 4 equals 9. Does not make that true. They can believe it all they want. It doesn't mean that every time you add up 4 plus 4 you're going to get 9. No, it just means you're going to get 8. And they'll believe it's 9. Pretty much how that goes. That doesn't really disprove or prove whether moral values exist. It's just how things work. People disagree on things. The idea that there are no moral values, or that there are no universal moral values, at best, You could just say we don't know for sure, based purely on what we're talking about. Again, we could go down the whole God road. Does God exist? And I personally believe he does, and therefore I personally believe there are objective morals because of that. But we could go down that whole rabbit trail. But just to say, at the very least, just the observation of being no agreement on universal values does not mean there's not universal values that exist or that are imposed upon human society. At best, with what we're operating within, the parameters we're operating within today, we just wouldn't be able to make a determinant factor on either one. But to say there are absolutely no universal values, in of itself, is sort of a universal value statement as well. So, take that for what it's worth. Now, moving on then to the third argument we were talking about. And now this one's more of an emotional argument. So the first two, I would say, have a lot of logical proponents to them, or they're based on observation, or they're based on logic, and they kind of follow a train of thought. This one, I hear quite often. People, this idea like, promote happiness, pursue your truth, do what makes you happy. Why do we worry so much about dogmatic truth or religion? We ought to be just care about benefiting society, making a better world. And that has a lot of implications in it. But let's just talk about it. You ought to promote social wellness rather than truth. So since we can't know truth, I mean, I don't think that, but under the idea that postmodernism is true, the idea that we can't know truth, therefore we should simply just pursue happiness and the wellness of society. People live for happiness, and people live for pleasure. Therefore, it ought to be a fundamental building block for what we do. People may disagree with this, but there is an actual real strong argument for the idea that people live for happiness. You may, as a soldier, you may go out to war and fight for your country. And you're like, well, I didn't do that because it makes me happy. I did that because I'm patriotic. Or I did that because I'm brave. I did that because I want to defend my family or my rights. But why did you do that? Why did you defend your family or rights? Why do you want to be brave? Well, because I want to stand up to my values. I want to live up to what I believe in. Okay, why do you want to do that? Well, I want to do that because it makes me feel good. Oh, why does it make you feel good? Well, I guess you could call it a sense of happiness or achievement or appreciation. So to a certain extent, there's actually a truth to this, that everything that we do to a certain extent is because it makes us feel good, gives us a sense of satisfaction at best, a sense of happiness. So everything we do is kind of for a sense of satisfaction, at the very least. We'll put it that way. Instead of saying happiness, we'll say everything we do is for a sense of satisfaction. Therefore, it ought to be a fundamental building block of ours to promote social wellness, to promote satisfaction, to promote happiness. And if everyone's happy, and everyone's doing well, and everyone's satisfied with life, then we'll reach utopia. It's this idea that we'll reach a perfect world. And again, as you can probably already see, there's a lot of premises here. First of all, that it assumes, normally when I hear this argument, people are assuming that this is the only world we have, or at the very best, we can't know if there's a world after our world, after we die. Therefore, we ought to just promote this world. So there's a lot of assumptions going on here. But truth isn't necessarily opposed to happiness. Just because someone's pursuing truth doesn't mean that it's opposed to satisfaction. The reason why we actually pursue truth is because we believe that actually will satisfy our beings, or that will bring ultimate happiness, or that will bring joy to the world. And also, how can you know what's best for people unless you know what's true? I can't know what's best for a human being unless I know the truth about how the world operates, truth about how they come to their satisfaction, truth about what makes them a person, truth about what makes a healthy person. Unless I know these truths, I won't be able to help them. I won't be able to make them happy. I won't be able to do well for them and give them good advice, for instance. And so the pursuit of truth isn't opposed to satisfaction. I would even say that the pursuit of truth actually leads to satisfaction ultimately. And again, you can't know what's good for people. By even on their own definitions of postmodernism, to say we ought to do what's good for people or we ought to promote social wellness, well, what is good for society? Well, I don't know. According to postmodernism, there isn't really no good for society. There's just things we do. And we can't know for sure if they're good or not. But they feel good, so we might as well try them. But if it feels good for you, doesn't mean it feels good for someone else. That's very subjective. And so it's just kind of a catch-22. It just doesn't really work. It just sort of falls apart. And all people may strive at their happiness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that pursuing the feeling or pursuing the feeling of satisfaction is going to help you. Actually, there's a lot of research, even just psychologically speaking, that shows you otherwise. So it just doesn't really seem to make much sense to pursue social wellness in ignorance of truth. Truth will oftentimes help people be better and help them improve upon themselves. And unless there is a fundamental truth, unless there is fundamental values, you can't say that people are improving. All you can say is that they're doing something. Because improving implies that you're becoming better, and becoming better implies that there's a standard. And that standard, if it's just your opinion, well then, awesome, I guess, for you. But there is then no universal way. You shouldn't then impose upon other people that they ought to do well. It becomes very selfish in that regard. So it just doesn't really seem to make much sense, and I don't believe truth in of itself is opposed to happiness or satisfaction, per se. So, let's just kind of go over a little bit what we just talked about. I think this is now a little bit more of just me kind of talking about my perception now on what we just talked about, and using the logic and the facts and the observations and some of the professionals in the research, pulling it all together here. Postmodernism sounds convincing, emotionally, at the very least. It sounds very convincing emotionally. Like, do what makes you happy, or you can't know what's true, so just do your best, or live life the way you want to. And to a certain extent, there's even a logic to it. I mean, it seems very true that we can't know for sure what truth is. It seems very true that everything is kind of just a structure. Everything is just kind of this idea of observation of differences. There's really no way to know fundamentals. And there seems to be a lot of a logic to it. There's almost like a mad genius to this, as I said. But the issue is the conclusions. A lot of times, what in my understanding, and by what I can best tell, and I was listening to a philosopher from University of Texas. I believe his name was David, but I'm not entirely sure. But University of Texas, a major in philosophy and stuff, a professor. He kind of talked about this idea that a lot of the things leading up to the conclusion of postmodernism seem to make somewhat sense. They seem to make some logical sense. They seem to be like, oh yeah, that sounds right. But then you get to the conclusion, you're like, you got something completely mangled up. You're like, no, there's something wrong. We did messed up somewhere along the way. And that's kind of how I see postmodernism. There seems to be this thing that makes sense where, yeah, you use a lot of circular reasoning to defend your reasoning or to defend reality. You can't know for sure things. Yeah, that seems about true that you can't really know for sure anything. But then you get to the conclusion and it's completely contradictory. Well, you're asserting a truth that we can't know truth. You're saying we can't know what truth is, so why are we trying to get to know truth? And no one actually practices postmodernism to its fullest because it's impossible to. So the conclusion of postmodernism doesn't make any sense, and therefore it just gets tossed to the side. It's unintelligible, it's self-contradictory, claims that there is no truth while asserting a truth. It claims you can't know truth while saying they know at least a truth. And it, at the common sense level, it just doesn't seem to make much sense. Saying this world doesn't exist is really weird because observationally speaking, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense at a common sense level. And when you get rid of all moral truth, when you get rid of all truth, when you get rid of all morals, when you get rid of all beliefs, and everything becomes subjective, or everything becomes, or when you get skeptical of absolutely everything in the world, that just leads to anarchist behavior, everyone living for themselves, a world without constraint, and it leads to destruction. It doesn't lead to structure. It doesn't lead to people thriving. It leads to pain. And if we have faith in humankind to be good, human history doesn't really side in our favor. There's a lot of evil in human history. So, at the end of the day, I don't think logically postmodernism stands. I think it doesn't make sense internally. I don't think it makes sense on its face. I don't think observationally it makes much sense. And I don't think even emotionally it's actually good. Because I think if we ignore truth or act as if truth isn't real, that we're going to hurt more people than we're going to help. So, at the end of the day, I don't think postmodernism is strong. I think it's skeptical for the sake of being skeptical because it sounds smart or makes people feel better. I don't know. But I understand. I understand why people believe it. I understand why it's convincing to a certain extent. I understand why it has appeal, but I don't think at the end of the day it makes the most sense. I don't think it's true. So, that is postmodernism wrapped up. And if you would like to learn more, I plan on putting some links in the subscription. I plan on putting in the description of this video on YouTube, and I'll try to put some links and stuff in the description for the podcast if you're listening on Apple or whatever. to some other philosophers and researchers and professionals on the topic that you can look at that I used preparing this podcast. If you would like to learn more about the topic and hear more arguments and more philosophers talk about the issue. But next time, moving on from postmodernism now, thank you for listening with me on this. But next time, we're going to be talking about critical theory. That's going to be the next issue we're going to be tackling. And a lot of you probably have heard a lot about critical theory in the current days that we're living in. Critical race theory, critical gender theory, all those things. We're going to talk about just critical theory itself. What is it, and what's the background of it? That's the next episode. So, if you'd like to learn more about critical theory, learn more about what all the hubbub's about, please tune in next time to learn more about critical theory. So, thank you for listening to this episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, please follow me on Instagram, follow me on Twitter, and if you'd like to check out more about my stuff, available at ltworld.info. And now, please, go out there and light the world, my friends.